Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Interfaith Paths to Peace. This is our Tuesday afternoon series that we will be doing for 4 weeks called Integral Life and Leadership, Cultivating a Path for Personal and Social Transformation. And I'm excited to welcome you. This IPP took the couple of months off and have now launching our series of courses. So we'll be on every day doing some really good programming, and I'm glad you all decided to join us. We've got a great group online, and for those of you that are joining us on Facebook, we want to welcome you as well. We will be using the chat box in our time together, so feel free to use the chat box. If you're joining us on Zoom, there will be a chance for you to join in the conversation and unmute yourself at the appropriate time. Thanks for joining. And we will also be recording this session. So those of you that are shared, do know that it will be recorded, or if you want to send it out to a friend or someone that you want to participate, please do that as well by sharing it on Facebook. It'll also be posted on our webpage. So welcome. I'm really excited about this series. The integral model and integral frameworks have been really important for me and transformative in my life. And I think are really important frameworks as we look at how do we cultivate our own growth personally, but also they're frameworks that we can use to look at the way in which we lead and also social transformation. So what we're going to be doing over the next 4 weeks is looking at these basically 5 integral maps. These were mostly developed by Ken Wilber, and I'll talk a little bit about Ken Wilber in a moment. And we're going to then take these 5 maps and then use them in different ways. Today we'll look at personal spiritual growth, an integral path for personal transformation. Next week, we're going to look at applying them to integral relationships, specifically romantic partnerships. And we'll see how these maps are helpful in helping us cultivate meaningful, life-giving relationships. The third week, we're going to look at politics. There's a new book that came out around integral politics, and I think these maps will be really helpful for us to understand the polarities that are happening in our world today. So I hope you'll come back. That'll be on the 16th. And then on the 23rd, we're going to look at how do we create an integral city? How do we take these maps and apply them specifically to Louisville, Kentucky? And how do we transform ourselves into the beloved community using these maps? So welcome to the journey. I also want to give a shout out. I've asked 3 people that I deeply appreciate and care for to be conversation partners, even though there's a lot of people on the Zoom call right now that I deeply appreciate. I have specifically asked Wes Tolbert, Dave Graffey, and Alicia Hullinger. I always say that wrong, Alicia. Tell me say your last name.
Hullinger.
Hullinger. I ought to know that because I'm German as well. So Hullinger. So Alicia and Wes and David, thank you for joining. What I've asked them to do is specifically reflect on, I'll have a Prezi where I'll share some of these integral maps. And then I just really would like for them to reflect on their perspective or what comes up for them as I'm presenting this. And they all represent different genders and race and age. So I intentionally wanted to hear different perspectives around this map. Essentially, that's what it's all about, is hearing and integrating different perspectives. And so Wes, Dave, and Alicia, thank you all for joining us. I'm going to have them introduce themselves in just a minute. If you have a question, please put that in the chat box, and we'll come back to that after I do the presentation. Wes, David, and Alicia will have a moment to share their reflections, and then we'll just open it up to conversation. And again, what a rich group of people that have joined us on the call today. So before we begin, and I'll have a prezi, I want to invite Wes and Dave and Alicia to introduce themselves in several minutes. So Wes, would you mind starting? Wes and I have just gotten to know each other in the last year, but our families knew each other back. Our parents know each other, and we found that out one night when we were sitting and hanging out. We all of a sudden realized our parents knew each other, and we have a lot of relationships. So Wes has been one of those inspiring people that I've just kind of fallen in love with recently. And I'm so thankful that you're on the call, Wes. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more?
Hey, how's everyone doing today? My name is Westerfield Tolbert. Most folks call me Wes. He, him. I am a Louisville transplant. I've been here half my life. The first half I was in White Plains, New York. I came here. I'm an alumni of both JCTC and the University of Louisville. Both my undergraduates are in political science. I currently work intimately with Black Lives Matter Louisville, as well as many urban nonprofits in Louisville. I'm 33 years old. As the judge said, our families intimately knew each other decades and decades ago. His parents and missionary work, and my parents also through missionary and service work came to know each other in Liberia, West Africa, where my family is originally from. I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. I chose to. When Judd asked me what company or what brand do you want to speak under, I just said use a Mind of Valor. Mind of Valor is a business that I work and enterprise that I am growing, where I coach people, especially entrepreneurs and artists, about how to best capitalize on their visions and take their imaginations unrestricted to produce something new and novel. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Wes. Look forward to having you in the conversation. David, I've known David for several years, and he has become, in many ways, a kind of a mentor and guide for me. Our paths have been different professionally, but he knows these maps and this work about as well as anybody I know. And so, David, deeply appreciative of your presence in my life and your integral leadership in the world. If you would introduce yourself a little bit. Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Judd. Good to be with everybody this afternoon. Name is David Graffi. I've been in Louisville for about 20, 21 years now. So I feel like my roots are pretty deep now. Ran an organization that's headquartered here and retired about a year and a half ago. And was exposed to Integral probably 2005 timeframe, 2010, something in that neck of the woods. And it has been influential to me as well in terms of helping me to see and understand, why we come at things in such different ways. So it's been very transformative for me. And not just from an intellectual understanding. I think if anything, what I've learned with Integral, at least the people that I've associated with, is the need to embody what Integral is really pointing to, not just have a map. Map is important, but embodiment is where all the juice is. I try to bring in integral thinking and development into the organization I led. And even though I am retired now, I am doing leadership training using an integral framework with an organization out of Dallas called Stegan Leadership Academy. Yeah, so that's probably good for now, Judd.
Great. Thanks, David. Thanks for being with us. And Alicia and I have known each other for several years now, and she's actually helping me think about my dissertation, which I've changed my topic now 4 different times, and Alicia has been with me through all 4 of those changes. Alicia has her PhD and works for a coaching organization. Alicia, thanks so much for being a friend and an integrative thinker along the way, and introduce yourself a little bit.
Thanks, Judd. And I can't wait to hear what the 5th dissertation topic is going to be.
I'm done. This is it.
Yes, my name is Alicia Hollinger, and I actually grew up in New Hampshire, and I've lived in many different cities across the US, but I've been in Louisville for the past 3.5 years. And before that, I was in Lexington. I'm a sociologist by training, so I was in Lexington for a minute doing my graduate work, but I've been in Louisville for the past 3.5 years, and that's how I came across and met Judd. And yes, as far as, Judd really has talked about integral theory from Wilber's perspective, and it really resonates with me because I definitely have been talking about the shift towards integration and what that means to me as really in line with what Judd is going to bring to the table. So I'm really excited about this conversation. And, integration, I really appreciate, David, what you said about embodying, because it is a practice, and it's very challenging to think about integration, especially in an era of such polarities and decisiveness. So it really is a challenge to be open to different perspectives. And I really appreciate what Wes said with his work with, really digging into visions and the imagination. And I think that's one way to help open up our critical thinking. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great, Alicia. Thanks so much. And we got a beautiful group of people on the call, about 20 of us right now, and we'll have a chance to harvest your wisdom as well. So thanks for being with us, everyone. I do want to jump into sharing these methods and frameworks called Integral. And I do have a Prezi that I'm going to share. I can also share this Prezi with you. If you want to message me, I can share the link if you want to come back to it at any point. And I will continue developing the Prezi over our next 4 weeks together. So I really am, one of my purposes in doing this is I believe in order to transform Louisville or to create the Louisville that we want, we need a community of integral thinkers. In some ways, what they call second tier consciousness. And we need a community of practice to form. The idea essentially is form follows consciousness. And so a lot of our work in Louisville is to cultivate consciousness, to help us be healthy leaders and individuals. And I believe these maps are part of that. And what I hope to do is to create a local community that can help create a curriculum, a life curriculum in Louisville to help us move through these stages of development, from birth to death. What would it take for us to put in place a Louisville curriculum to help us move through the stages of development more quickly and easily as we're ready? So that's what this series is about and in service to. And again, thanks for all of the folks that are joining us. I do want to introduce you to Ken Wilber. Ken Wilber is this fascinating guy. I came across him when I was in college, and he is the one that put together, in many ways, these integral maps, although there's been a lot of work done by the integral community. And the slides and stuff that you'll see have been created by a lot of different people. So Ken Wilber, one of the things he's known for is this statement that I really believe is important. He says, I have one major rule: everybody is right. More specifically, everybody, including me, has some important pieces of truth, and all of those pieces need to be honored, cherished, and included in a more gracious, spacious, and compassionate embrace. And so that's what we're going to look at, is perspectives and what everybody adds. The question is that everyone is right. The question is, how are they right? And if we can see their perspective using these maps, then we can honor each other, have compassion for each other, and I think move forward collectively. Ken is an interesting guy. So he's in his 70s now, was born in 59, I believe, or 49. he went to Duke University, but dropped out of school because he thought they were just teaching rote memory. And he, in many ways, Ken's got this really interesting, he's got the biggest, he's the guy that got over a big ego and yet still has it. I mean, he's an interesting dude. The picture over here is with his Treya, who was his wife that he met, and they were together, and she died within 3 years. He wrote a book about it called Grace and Grit. So if you want the most humanizing picture of Ken Wilber, I would read Grace and Grit. This is a picture of him now. Ken Wilber actually has come down with a disease that has affected the way he has aged. He had a stroke several years back. Yeah, he has this disease that affects him, and it's an autoimmune disease called RNase enzyme deficiency disease. And so he still works in Boulder. He's written 23 books, and they over 25 books. These are just a selection of them. They've been translated into 30 different languages. And so he's taken this model and applied it, as you can see, in all of these different ways. If you're interested in reading, I would start with this one on the left, A Brief History of Everything, which is kind of a basic introduction to his thought. Again, if you want to know the Ken Wilber, Grace and Grit is an important one. Integral Psychology has been very helpful to me and influential. My first work was in psychology. Those of you that are interested in integral meditation, he's known for that. That book's there at the bottom in the center. And also, we're going to be briefly looking at integral life practice here in a few moments. Anyway, these are some of the books that Ken has produced. He's a fascinating person. He was actually raised Southern Baptist, like myself, in Oklahoma. I wasn't raised in Oklahoma, but I was raised Southern Baptist. And so it's interesting, he became a Zen practitioner primarily, and many people call him kind of the Einstein of spirituality. And I would encourage you to check him out. He's been very influential in a lot of thinkers, including Bill Clinton and Al Gore, Deepak Chopra, Richard Rohr. All of these folks point to Ken Wilber as a deep thinker and influential in their life. So I will jump in. Again, I would encourage you to go back to any of these books, and I'm going to be giving you kind of a brief overview of his integral framework. So essentially, this map right here takes all of the things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be looking at 5 different integral maps, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. I do want you to get a taste of them because we're going to be applying them over the next several weeks. This one slide has all of those. We're going to be looking at what's called AQUAL, which is all quadrants, levels, stages, states, lines, and types. And so if you can have in the back of your mind these 5 maps that I'm going to show you, then we can apply them to a variety of different things. So we'll come back to this map. Essentially, I'm going to break this map down as we look at the 5 different maps. The first one, and I think the most important, is called Stages and Waves of Development. And I wanted to, I've got a slide here that I've created. This is my kind of version of an integral psychosocial graph. I essentially think if you can identify yourself on this in all of these different boxes, you'll have a pretty good sense of your own self-understanding. You have a pretty good sense of your perspective and how that has been contextualized. And if you can understand and appreciate where other people show up on this box, then I think you can have a great deal of compassion and empathy for them, and also help integrate and make use of their perspectives. So we'll come back to that. Essentially, this map is looking at, over on the left side, there's what we're going to be looking at now. It's called Stages of Development. Let me talk a little bit about stages of development. A lot of this work has come from Spiral Dynamics by Claire Graves, made popular by Beck. And what these developmental stages, or often we could call them waves of development, it is based upon developmental psychology. In other words, that we go through these different developmental phases where we see the world differently. So these are systems or value ranking. They're also called value memes. Each of these is a value memes, which means it ranks certain values over other values. And as we develop, these values are shaped by our environment and our context. First, I want to say that these are systems in people, not typologies. In other words, we go through these, they're not types of people like I've got over here on this personality, and we'll look at these in a moment. The Enneagram are types of people, but you would go through these different stages of development. As, for example, I'm an Enneagram 7, I would go through these different stages as a 7. My 7ness doesn't necessarily change. It's a type, but it will be manifested differently based upon what level of development, conscious development I'm at, which is the worldviews and the waves of development. Worldviews are not the same as religious beliefs. And I've also got religious beliefs over here, or what I call religious cosmologies. You will express your religion out of the worldview. And so you can remain a Christian and developmentally move up through these worldviews and express your religion at different waves or forms of development. And we can see this in a moment. We'll look at the specific wave, but like the purple or red wave, we can see that transcends religious traditions. So you have what we would call Buddhist militant Buddhism, or militant Islam, or militant Christianity, or militant agnosticism, or militant New Age, or militant environmental, whatever your cosmology is not what we're looking at when we're looking at stages of development. So we'll see how all of these worldviews manifest differently in the different religious traditions. We can also say that they're not necessarily political perspectives, although political perspectives would change, but it's not to say that everybody that's green is necessarily a Democrat. Although there are some overlaps between those. You could be a Republican and be at a green wave as well. So I want to make a distinction between these typologies and waves of development or value memes. There's also, these are not related to race or ethnicity. Any race can be at any place in these. Those will contextualize your worldview, but they don't necessarily limit your worldview based upon your race. We all have these capacities. Now, our environment does shape the capacity for us to move through these, and many of you all may know the stages of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and this is very similar to stages of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Basically, the needs at one worldview need to be met, and then the environment needs to be available to move to the next worldview. And that's a lot of the work that we're going to talk about in the last 2 weeks, is how do we create a curriculum so that people can move through these worldviews. Each of the worldview is developmental, or it's holarchical is another way we can say it. I'm not going to go through at the moment all the different specifics of these. I just want you to see that each of these worldviews has different characteristics. We'll come back to these in future weeks. I just want you to understand worldviews and stage development. Another ways you can imagine this is if you look at it in circles. So what's important is to note that we have different centers of gravity. And as we develop, these are holarchical, which means they're not necessarily hierarchical, but holarchical, one stage transcends and includes the values, the gifts, and perspectives of the worldview that came before it. So you don't dismiss it, and you're not, for example, you don't say, well, I'm green. What you would say is maybe my center of gravity is at green, but I still have these other worldviews, value systems, perspectives in me. And at times they can be great resources. We know that when, for example, when there's times of great chaos and change in our culture, we drop to lower levels of development because those values helped us thrive and survive in different conditions. So in times of war, for example, you might have a center of being at green or yellow, but you would drop down to purple survival techniques. That's why I love those movies of the apocalypse, or like when the zombies come out. You know, you can be a very moral, citizen, consider yourself very enlightened, but when the zombies come out, right, you're shooting your best friend if they've got food, kind of deal. So it's a really important to note that we have all of these systems in us, and a lot of times it's the environment that allows us to access them. So holarchies is another way of saying different than hierarchies. And a lot of our green postmodernists don't like hierarchies, so we say holarchies. It's important to note, again, here's what I mean by centers of gravity, that our culture is made up of all of these different lines and levels of development currently. So if we look at Louisville, it would be important to note that we've got people in Louisville at all of these stages and worldviews. And that's important to note when we're working with different populations, is to have some sense of where their value system is. And we'll talk about some of the characteristics of these value systems in future weeks. So this is a basic introduction. I want you to basically understand stages of development. And that's one of the maps that we need to use for our own personal growth, but also to understand other people. There may be some questions about that, but I want to move through these maps and then we can come back to those if you have them. Next thing I want to look at is what's called the 4 quadrants. And the 4 quadrants are different ways to look at anything that kind of arises. 4 quadrants, if you see this map here, I'll go through these. The top left is what's called the interior subjective realm. And each of us can be aware of this. This is your space of meaning making. This is what goes on in your head. It's the subjective awareness that you have. It's your thoughts, your feelings, your values. Those are subjective to you. In other words, other people don't have access to those unless you tell them about that. So it's your subjective experience. This is what was known as, Plato called this the beautiful, the area of the beautiful. It's my subjective experience of something. So meditative states fit in this category. Again, it's subjective to you and it's an individual experience. So the top is what we call the area of individual. So the left quadrant is me, my meaning, and the right quadrant is anything that arises in the objective world. And so you can measure this in the objective world, but it is singular or an individual. So these are this is my body, which you can see, you can measure. This is what quantitative analysis does. It measures these things. It can measure your behavior, your actions. There are things that people can see and measure, and that's in the top right quadrant. And those are important to distinguish what's subjective to me and what's objective that we can look at. And both of these realms are valuable and important. Science has in many ways overvalued the top right, or the right objective. It's become very good at that. And this is what Plato called the true. The top right and the bottom right are what's called the true. They're in the objective category. We can look at them together and we can have conversation about them. The bottom two quadrants are what we call the collective, and the bottom, what's called the lower left, is intersubjectivity. That's a sense of we. And again, that's internal. So it's a sense of we-ness, a sense of my family or my culture or our collective worldviews. Again, we can't necessarily all see this, but it's this kind of sense that we get each other, we know each other. We have these collective kinds of experiences that we share. The bottom right is when those move into physical manifestation, we can see them, and that's collective structures. That's a city, that's an organization. That is when people come together out of the same worldview, they create artifacts. And these are things we can look at, we can see. And so that's the bottom right. Now, this is really important because these are all interrelated, right? So our environment shapes our collective experience. Our collective experience influences our individual experience. Our individual experience shapes our collective experience. These are all interrelated, but it's important when we're analyzing something. For example, if we talk about we want to create a racially just city, we would look at what work do we need to do in these four quadrants. So like, for example, the top left quadrant could be around, have you experienced racism against you, or are you the perpetrator of racism from your own experience, your own values? And then what are the actions of discrimination? So the top left is bias. The top right is discrimination. So it's a perspective that took action in the form of discrimination. But we need to look at those differently. So if we're going to analyze that experience, we would want to look at the subjective experience and the objective experience in individuals and in collective, which is the bottom right. If you want to change the system, you have to look at the worldviews of that system. Who is creating our government, for example? Who's writing policies at Metro government around racism? You would have to look at their collective assumptions and worldviews, because they will create policy, which is lower right, organizational structure. And we need to engage from an integral perspective. We need to engage all of those areas in order to have what we call integral transformation. That's why this map is so important, because it gives us lenses to look at our own experience and the lenses to look at social transformation. So I'm going to keep going. Again, you don't have to memorize these. The third is what's called states of consciousness. States of consciousness are temporary moments of the change in consciousness. And we experience these every day in waking, sleeping, and dreaming. So we can measure our brain waves. And so that would be top right, right? So it's an individual's brain waves. And we can see that their brain waves change. We can measure that. And we can know, we ask them, when you have them hooked up to these EKGs, you can ask them what's going on in your subjective awareness. And people often will state the same thing. So like in active thought, or when you're engaged right now, hopefully it's your gamma waves. So we can measure gamma waves, but we don't know what's going on in your subjective thinking. So we go through all of these states every day, from waking, dreaming, to deep sleep. You can also change your states using, medication or using drugs. And these are temporary states of consciousness. And we need to be aware of those because different information comes up in our subjective awareness. So when we're in a meditative state, for example, we have different subjective experiences. And we need to learn to cultivate those states of consciousness because they have different experiences to our subjective awareness. which are really important, right? Relaxation, or feeling at one with our universe, or doing dream work. And we know that dreams happen in this theta and delta brain waves. So states are really important, and learning to change states is important. This is called the Wilber matrix, the Wilber-Coombs matrix. And so what you see is the levels of development on the left that we just talked about, or stages of development. And then you have states of development at the bottom that show what we call gross, subtle, causal, witness, and non-dual. These are states that meditators go through in meditation. So there are techniques you can use to move your state through these gross, subtle, causal, witness, and non-dual experiences. But you will interpret those states out of your stage of development. And that's what's really important. States are interpreted through stage and other cultural contexts. For example, somebody who has a mystical experience, maybe a causal or a witness experience that's Buddhist or Hindu, they may have the god Shiva show up in that state. A Christian may have Jesus show up in that state, because that is what is available at that realm. It's the archetypical realm that these mystical experiences may have. But then you will interpret that. So if let's say you are a Hindu, you would interpret that as your, and let's say you're at a magic level or a mythic level of your stage development, you will interpret that literally. So Shiva will be literally Shiva, and that will be your God from your culture. And people that don't have that experience will be excluded. A lot like Christian evangelicalism, that they may have an experience of Jesus. Let's say you're in you're having a Pentecostal kind of experience where the Holy Spirit speaks, or you have this image of Jesus coming to you. Well, that would be interpreted, if you're at a lower level of development, as your personal Jesus, and Jesus came to save you personally. Higher stages of development wouldn't necessarily do that, that they would have a wider worldview and wider perspective. So this is why it's important, especially when we look at spiritual experiences, to look at what's the state you're in, how do we cultivate states, and then how do we interpret them out of our worldviews. We can come back to that more. If you're interested in that, that's basically what Ken Wilber's book is about, on integral spirituality. If you're interested in this realm applied to religious or spiritual experience, I would encourage you to check out that book. Okay, we're going to keep moving. The fourth map is what we call types. And types are what we understand as like the Enneagram, Myers-Briggs. These are types that pretty much stay with us throughout our life. They may change a little bit. We talk about healthy expressions of your Enneagram, unhealthy expressions. Myers-Briggs is a type as well. You could also call gender in some ways a type, so that we go through basically identifying as a male or a female, although in higher levels of development that may become androgynous. And we'll talk about that when we talk about relationships next week. But those are types. And so it's important to know your type. There's a lot of coaching language around types, helps us understand why people show up the way they do. And you all know me, I'm a huge Enneagram fan. I think it's a great way to understand typology. Myers-Briggs is also a really good typology as well. We'll look at typology more next week when we look at relationships, but that's what types are. And then the fifth map is what we call lines of development. And these are simply different forms of intelligences. You all may know Howard Gardner's different intelligences. So we go through life in some ways often having gifts in different intelligences, musical intelligence, kinesthetic, naturalistic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, spatial, linguistic, logic, musical. So you may have a predisposition to having a certain high level of intelligence, but that intelligence will go through your stages of development as well. So Mozart, let's say, was highly developed in his musical intelligence. So he was like at a top integrative place. He was at a 7 second tier level with his musical capacity, but his interpersonal capacity was very limited. He did not have healthy relationships. So again, you can be at these levels or stages in different places of lines of development. And that's why it's important to make a distinction between those. And we want to cultivate these. You know, Michael Jordan is kinesthetically, he's a genius. He's at a high level of integrative capacity in his kinesthetic intelligence, but he may not be in a musical intelligence. So that's important to make a distinction about these natural intelligences that we go through life with. These can also be cultivated as well. Related to states are these different things that people have measured. For example, these are cognitive development was measured. That's a line, but it goes through these different, you see on the left, that's levels of consciousness, and we can measure those. Moral development has been measured by a guy named Kohlberg. He's not on here, but Kohlberg measured moral development and showed how we go through these different levels of developing our morality. So that's just basically what this chart shows you, different people measuring different lines of development. We can come back to that if you're interested. So I'm going to end really quickly with what's called integral practice. And this is kind of the takeaway for today. I'm going to be using what's called the integral life practice matrix. And essentially, integral practice says there are these different areas of us called the body, mind, spirit, and soul, or shadow, where we need to do integrative practice in. So a lot of the coaching work that I do, and coaches will use this kind of model to ask you questions about, do you have practices in these core areas? And the core areas that they've got are body, mind, spirit, and shadow. And if you're developing an integral life practice, you would pull one practice and do regularly one of these practices from each of these main categories over here on the left called core practice. So I think an integral community of practice would hold each other accountable for doing body practice. You know, that's fit diet, exercise, cardiovascular work. Mind practice would be what we're doing right now, hopefully learning, cognitive development. You would want to find a primary practice there and go deep in those practices. Spirit practices are what we would call meditative practice. Prayer could be Christian prayer, Buddhist prayer, different practices you see are listed there. And then what I think is really important is shadow practice or some form of therapy. And this is really what trips people up a lot, is they may put in place these other practices, but if you don't have some form of psychotherapeutic practice where you're dealing with the unconscious, that's usually where I experience we get tripped up. And that's what's tripped me up in my leadership in life in the past, is I didn't integrate shadow aspects of my personality. And those ended up hurting me and hurting other people. And that's why I think shadow practice, some form of psychotherapeutic practice, dream work, dream groups, is essential for leadership. Then they also have these auxiliary practices. You know, you can look at ethics, sex, work, emotional relationships. An integral practice, this comes out of a book called Integral Life Practice that I would encourage you to look at. And leaders, anybody on the call, I would really encourage you to think about, do you have a regular practice especially in the first 4 areas. And if not, develop one. And often they say that it is these core practices that are grease the wheel of stage development. And that's why it's so important that we as a community cultivate these practices, because they lead to higher levels of consciousness. If you want, they say it takes 5 to 6 to 7 years of intentional practice in order to move through a different stage of development. And stages of development are really the key, because they help us have a larger perspective. Okay, folks, I hope that was not too crazy. I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn it over to specifically to our Wes, David, and Alicia, just to share some thoughts and reflections about what was coming up for them, and then we can have some dialogue as we go forward. That's the most I'm going to teach. You won't, next sessions, you won't hear me doing that much. I'll just kind of refer to these and then we'll apply them. So thanks for hanging in there on the 5 maps. So let's go, Wes, Dave, and Alicia. Any initial thoughts, feedback? I'm really interested in what's coming up for you and your perspective on these.
You know, I jotted down multiple notes, a lot of thoughts. But, you know, in particular, I think about, in this context, how spaces have evolved and how we've evolved to really treat spaces, especially in an age of COVID where we're Zooming everywhere, just to how we're more mindful when we start meetings. For example, most meetings that we start, that we've been a part of, will start with some degree of mindfulness, a moment of reflection. How are you feeling? What state are you in? We'll use pronouns so people have a clear context of how they should relate to one another. And I think those at the surface level open the door for us to at least have conversations with people who we don't know, but if we can know certain things about them, then we can feel more comfortable. Based on the integral psychosocial graph, that's that he, him, or that she, her, or the they, or whatever pronouns you use to identify yourself, and how that those rankings can sometimes work in our favor when we disclose them, and other times can be somewhat of an anchor if we don't feel comfortable to be our full selves and fully self-actualize in spaces. Yeah.
Thanks, Wes. Yeah, appreciate that. We'll come back to some of that. David, and then Alicia, initial thoughts?
Yeah, I guess one was just a refresher of how complex the map is. So as I was tracking along what you were saying, it was triggering up all kinds of study I had done in the past. And so it takes a while to digest the comprehensiveness of it. And that's why it's called integral, right? Because it takes the best and tries to put a cohesive framework on everything. I think that a bit of context that kept on popping up for me, and I'm not quite sure why, but this is all about human experience. You know, what is human experience? And the way that as the experiencer, you know, each of us, what kind of dynamics impact that. So we do have this personal experience, and I can locate that in myself, my own subjective self. And here we are in a community of we, so I can locate myself in the we. And then there's using the technology, for example, and that gets into those right pieces that you were talking about on the external or the its that he talks about. So it's I am reminded of how the different quadrants that you highlighted are all different ways of seeing and understanding different aspects of our experience, and the importance of not excluding any or over relying on any. So how much do I overly, like I'm more of an I guy, I'm an introvert, I love going deep. And so that top left quadrant is a place that I rely a lot on. And the we is something that I have to actively cultivate. And running a business, I can't ignore the it's, how are we doing financially? Do we have cash flow? Are we going to make payroll? Can we invest in some new technology to reach more people? Whatever. So maybe my contribution at this point is just to say that we all maybe over rely on one of those quadrants, or maybe on, as you talked about, ignoring maybe the shadow a little bit when you talked about that, Judd, and how to say that if I wish to live a life of growth and development, I have to lean into those uncomfortable spots in myself, those quadrants I don't look at, the shadow maybe that I don't look at. Maybe I'm not attentive to my physicality. I need exercise and better weight management and food choices. That all these things, all these different parts of our experience influence our ability to engage and be in the world.
Thanks, David. Appreciate bringing in that leadership in organizations and business as well. That's important. Alicia.
Yeah, just to build on what Wes and David said, and after your very nice class, Judd, thank you. I feel like I'm taking a test now with, but it was great. It was very thorough. Thank you. I think what just bubbled up listening to Wes and David is definitely the idea of the comfort zone and the significance and importance of the shadow work that is really important in order to move towards an integrated worldview, if you will, which is really being open and non-judgmental to different perspectives. And that's can be very uncomfortable if we haven't done our own personal shadow work. And so, it's really digging in to that shadow and discomfort within ourselves, but also then we can show up and have those hard conversations that are uncomfortable with others. If we're able to lean into our own shadow and find a way to be comfortable with the discomfort, if you will, then we have started to build the skills that allow us to come to very hard conversations and be open and non-judgmental when others are sharing their perspective, their worldview. So that was bubbling up, I think, because, Wes talked about how people come into conversations, and if the space isn't safe enough for them to feel comfortable to be their full self. And then David also talked definitely about the shadow work piece. So I think that's important to note.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to open it up. We've had some questions in the chat box, but I want to give you a chance, those that are joining us. And again, what a beautiful group of people, a deep appreciation for all the ways you guys are living in the world. Are there questions or comments that came up from those that are participants? You're welcome to unmute yourself or raise your hand and I can unmute you, and just share a comment. If you have a question, share a question, or just jump into the conversation and let's see what starts emerging.
I know there's a lot of commentary out there and everyone's eager, but I think the scholar Joppa months ago made a comment in one of our meetings when we're dealing with people and we're interacting with them, that we have to be aware if someone's operating from their ego or from their trauma. And I think that really ties into that shadow work area, which is really important towards self-actualization. I just think that if Jaffa could speak on ego versus trauma, that would be awesome. But more importantly, it's just that a lot of times we don't know necessarily if we're coming from a place of ego or trauma. And it really takes a deep dive and looking at the spectrum of where we are to, even better relate to other people.
Yeah, thank you. Japa, and Japa, you asked a question here, but if you want to follow up with what Wes asked. And Japa, you're still on. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I mean, I'll try to say a little bit about that. I mean, if I think of it this way, when I work with children, there's a kind of integral approach that I use. We look at children in stages based on how they draw pictures, and we can look at these drawings and we know what is archetypal for a certain stage. And for example, a typical first grader would draw themselves standing on an horizon line looking out of the picture. And that's a good indication of their state of consciousness. As they move to the second grade, they learn to be able to turn that picture in profile so they can move back and forth on the line. Now, when we look at children, we can look at those pictures and tell what has happened, what the trauma how they have failed in their, or not had the opportunity to do certain sensory integration. And so looking at that picture, I can say, oh, this child at second grade, hasn't integrated certain capacities because of the trauma they've experienced in their lives due to, whatever has happened, the lack of mobility in their life, things like that. So this picture to me is a map we use of waves of stages. And I can look at those maps, and have an indication of what the experience of the child has been. And so when you talk the difference in ego, there can be something in the picture though, which can tell me something about the child uniquely, which isn't a result of trauma, but a way that they particularly are bringing something into the world that's very different, and it'll show up in their picture as a certain use of color or certain kind of shapes, a certain way of drawing their houses, and so we can see that this is ego, and so that they are bringing their interest into the picture. So in a situation that I was talking about with Wes, you look at someone and ask yourself, are they bringing their particular interest in? When I talk about ego, or are they behaving in a certain way based on some kind of condition of their being that we have to relate to? So that's how I look at ego and trauma, and how as a teacher working with picture drawing in children, I do the same thing that addresses that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Judd. This is Raju with our global mediation team out in Boulder.
Hey, Roger. Yes.
And thank you for hosting this. I'm sure it's helping all of us in our own different ways. I'm addressing the situation with India and Pakistan. They've been having this global conflict going on for years. And so we're looking at virtual reality being used to help address trauma, because we're looking at how virtual reality can invoke empathy, and how do we invoke empathy in people is through helping them address, well, first to put each other in each other's shoes, but also to address a trauma, because without addressing trauma, it's very hard for these countries to move forward in conflict resolution. So I really appreciate the whole discussion about whether individuals are actually coming forth from a place of trauma or their ego. And I think that on some level, it feels like to me that we're, as long as there is a human conflict or there is a human situation that still needs healing, we're all on some level coming from ego, and we're all on some level coming from trauma, because Otherwise, the conflicts would heal, that would stop. So how do we address egos, and how do we address trauma? How do we address these very issues that are preventing us from moving forward? It's not like we don't have peacekeepers. It's not like we don't have the information. It's not like we don't have the will. Yet there is something stopping us. There is something preventing the next step. And it's really about, I feel like what I'm getting is that I'd like to get your input on this and your feedback, is how do we address the issues of trauma and egos that prevent us from moving forward in conflicts?
Yeah, Raju, thank you. And thank you for the work you're doing. That's fascinating. I'd like to hear more about that using virtual reality. And that's a way of moving what we call the top right quadrant to affect the left quadrant, so that you affect, brain waves or what's happening in the brains to configure the brain, reconfigure the trauma brain. I mean, one of the things we know about trauma is it has a neurological connection, that the place where the trauma is stored has created neurological connections, often to the amygdala, the reptilian brain that's got the fight and flight or freeze mechanisms. And so when you bump into it, you have to literally the brain has to change its firing synapses in order to tap into other parts of the self or the brain, in order to have a different kind of response. So I'm fascinated that you're using virtual reality to do that. They've actually shown that virtual reality has some really powerful impacts on prejudice and discrimination, that we actually can use virtual reality and videos in order to create openness that confronts prejudice and discrimination. I would say I would check out the work that Claire Graves and Don Beck have done with spiral dynamics, because I think they show that you have to address the underlying conditions of these cultures. One of the things we know about fundamentalism that shows up wherever is it's often hides the fear of survival, that I'm not going to have enough. So that the conservative lack of ability to take perspective naturally emerges when people have environments where they have enough to eat, where they have safety and shelter, where they have rich environments to be able to take the perspective of others. And so I think a lot of the global peacemaking work really does have to deal with these environments where people don't have safety, security, enough to eat, because they are seedbeds for the lack of cognitive development or perspective taking development. There's been some really good work that Beck has done in global kind of peacemaking that I would encourage you to check out.
Okay,
Are there other?
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us. Even from Boulder, that's where Ken Wilber lives. I mean, so you're in the integral hub over there. And I have not met Ken Wilber. I think you asked me that. I've got a book signed by him, but I've never met him personally. Does anybody else?
His location on Walnut, they have the Integral Life Center on Walnut Avenue here in Boulder. But that's about 2 miles away from me. I could literally walk there.
Oh my gosh!
Wow. And so I'm looking up Ken Wilber as we speak to see. And yes, he gave a talk like about a mile away from where I live now. So I'm going to keep looking and seeing if I can hook up with him, just to even listen to him and be in his own, be in his space and be in his vibes.
Yeah, and that's where he has become kind of a cultish leader, but again, I believe in what we would call transmission at a subtle realm of energy. And I believe people that are highly conscious actually do have a subtle body that when you come into the presence of it, you are actually receiving in the subtle realm information or consciousness that comes from them. And you can find that in all of our spiritual traditions. People actually have a subtle body that when you come in contact with it can help you wake up. It can actually help at the neurological level of having the infrastructure in your brain of waking up.
Thank you, Chuck, for your feedback, and I'll stay in touch with you. I'll give you some feedback. I'll let you know what's going on, and I'll try to get in touch with more integral people to feed into this project, because I think that I think this project can help. The integral approach can help any project. So I look forward to reaching out more.
Beautiful. Yeah, let's stay in touch. Does anybody have any other responses to Raju? I mean, there's a lot of wisdom on this call. Anybody want to jump in there? Or anybody else have other questions? Yeah, let's open it up again. Or responses. We got a few more minutes here before we kind of begin to close.
Yeah, since I heard the word, trauma, and then the kind of the collective or societal trauma as well, Thomas Hübl has done a lot of, he's a mystic who's done a lot of cultural trauma work. He's lives in Israel, and he's been working quite a bit with the Holocaust and trauma that is in Germany and in Israel. The whole world, all of us carry it to some extent, but really gravitates to those two geographic centers. And I know he's done an extensive amount of work trying to attend to more of that we space, that we quadrant as it relates to trauma. It's collective trauma. So
David, would you repeat his name, please?
Yeah,
again?
his name's Thomas Hübl, Huebl. And he does, he does collective trauma work. His term for societal trauma is collective trauma.
Thank you very much, because at the Geneva Peace Week, they were addressing trauma during the peace talks for the week. This is the first time I've heard it, but they are definitely addressing trauma, and there's a lot of organizations that are out there trying to bring the healing around trauma. So I look forward. I'll look that up, David. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So
go ahead.
So what's coming to mind here as just thinking about the collective consciousness, if you will, or the collective, and how it's important to, I guess in an integral perspective, how we have to hold a lot in our hand. We have to be able to hold the collective wisdom, the collective folly, and there's the healing work that needs to happen along with all of the other work. And that's probably can feel very overwhelming, right? As far as where do I start? There's this healing of trauma that needs to be done. And yet there's a lot of collective folly or individual folly as far as getting in the way from us moving and shifting towards a collective wisdom or individual wisdom. And so I think there's more questions than answers, obviously, here. And those questions, though, are important to ask to help us really stop and reflect and think. So I'm just reflecting here as far as what has been said with the virtual reality work and bringing societies and the collective together. And yeah, I just wanted to reflect on that. That's it.
Good, thank you. Other questions or reflections? Yeah, Wes.
That makes me think, just thinking about intersubjectivity and how we create these cultural artifacts, and how often trauma, because of the media and society, is experienced collectively, but then healing or reconciliation is often a personal matter. We have to come to some form of peace before we can go back into the larger community and truly be impactful. So that bottom right, it sits heavy because we're dealing with collective structures. I'm not sure if this is a byproduct of capitalism or scarcity, but we we become victims together, but then we have to find our way back to, that peace alone. Oftentimes, and you see this with people who deal with depression and anxiety. They're often told to heal and then come back, or see a therapist and find peace and then come back to the whole. But I just wonder how we can be just through practices like this, but be more intentional about what that healing looks like communally, and how we can be better fit for one another.
Yeah, I want to follow up with that, Wes. I'm really interested in, specifically as we're talking about Louisville. I'm interested in that collective racial trauma work that is both, the work of Black people and white people, because we all have trauma from the ways that we have treated each other historically. And I think there are some of these methods that I'm interested in. One is this constellation work that David gave mention to, Thomas Hubel. And there's also what's called constellations, family constellations work. And can we create an opportunity to have a constellation for Louisville to see what might emerge? That's an interesting practice. So if anybody's interested in that, let's see if we can bring an experience like that to Louisville to get at specifically the systemic and unconscious trauma that we're dealing with as a system. There's also what's called dream work, collective dream work. And in fact, in April, we're going to be doing a social dreaming course where we're going to, for 4 weeks, imagine that our dreams are not individual dreams, but they're collective dreams. To see if we can listen to the collective soul of the city to tell us about what we collectively need to bring into consciousness. That's the idea that individual dream work tells us what our individual psyches need in order to be whole, to integrate. But what if we could dream the future Louisville by listening to our dreams, not as individual dreams, but as collective dreams, and allow it to speak to us like community psychotherapy. So that's a practice that we're going to be experimenting with in April as well.
Judd, I want to mention art as a way of healing trauma. Art used to be like something that we had access to as individuals, but now art has been so rarefied, and it's been only certain people get to be an expert now to do art. And I think in the past, art was more readily available to us as a means for healing. And I know as a teacher in the Waldorf schools, we use art all the time. It's a central way that we teach and rehabilitate issues. And I just think to a certain degree, we have to get back to the use of art, as a way of healing our own trauma, and then maybe even collective art. But we have lost access to it. We believe we can't do it or it belongs to someone else. You got to get paid for it or whatever. And I just think it's a resource that we've lost.
Judd, can I just piggyback on that a little bit?
Please.
I'm just so glad we're talking about the unconscious. And then you brought up the whole aspect of dreams. And now Japa brought up the aspect of art. And dreams and art are considered, I believe, the power of the subconscious mind, the power to access that part of our brain where we can command, and we are in touch with, but we need the communication aspect of it. We need to know how to communicate to that part of our self. And then to do it collectively, as Wes has talked about, to do it collectively, how do we address these issues collectively? Because as we've known so much, we all have individual traumas and individual dreams. But how do we empower the collective? How do we bring it all together and create a synergetic force that can move move things for us in a positive direction? So I appreciate all the different aspects and all the different perspectives.
Beautiful. Thank you. And thank you for yours. So what I want to do, we've got 10 minutes left. I'd like for us to do a practice where we just kind of take a moment to be silent, reflect, and then I'm going to give us each like 15 to 20 seconds to check out if you're interested. And what I'd like for you to just take a moment to say, what in our conversation is really emerging for you? Is there a moment where you really lit up? Is there a question you're coming away from this with? Is there an area where you want to do more work? And in 15 to 20 seconds, when we come out of that, just share what's emerging for you. So move out of your mind into your body a little bit. If you want to close your eyes and give us maybe 30, 45 seconds to just be present and listen to what emerges for you first. And then stay with that and share that in a moment as you're comfortable. So what I'd like for you to do, if you have access to the chat box, is just in a phrase or a sentence or a few words, type what kind of summarizes that so I can have it written. And then I'll invite us to unmute ourselves and share. I'll just kind of go through our list really quickly. And again, we only have about 15, 20 seconds, but I'd like to hear what's emerging in the collective space. So take a moment and then share that in the chat box first. If you can type that out, if you have access to that. What's the phrase or theme? So you go ahead and send that so we can all read it, but I'd like for you to verbally share if you would be interested. So I'm just going to go through us really quickly. You can unmute yourself and share in 15, 20 seconds. I'm going to start Woody Miller, if you would be willing to unmute yourself and share, and then I'm going to go Diana Clem and then Tina. Woody?
Yeah, the thought that came into my mind is that we have lost any sense of who our neighbor is. That's a biblical question, but I think we need to start in our own block and get to know one another and then expand that definition of neighbor to be more embrace more people in our circle of who we define as neighbor.
Beautiful. Thank you, Woody. Diana, do you want to share? And then Tina? I don't want to call people if you don't want to share, so you don't need to. Tina, would you be willing to share?
I'm sorry. I
Diana,
lost it.
sure.
It came to me just this thought of just having a physical little gesture that meant something heart to heart as we greet each other and not having to speak or anything, complete strangers, but that would be a Louisville thing. And a Louisville high five, sort of.
I love that idea. Yeah, Louisville high five. Yeah. Thank you, Diana. Yeah. Tina and then Lee. And again, you don't have to share if you would not like. Lee, would you be willing to share? And then Julie?
Yes, it's Leah.
Leah.
You had it right the first time. Thanks. Two of the big things that really stood. This has been wonderful, by the way. Thank you all so much for the education and discussion. The couple of takeaways that I have really gained some perspective from, and that have been coming up both in my personal and professional life, is the importance of the shadow work. Pulling people along and understanding that if we're waiting for ourselves to heal completely, that work is never completely done. And so in order for us to make societal change and change outside of ourselves, that has to be a constant process. So I really appreciated that. And then the maps are just really cool. I agree with kind of what Alicia said earlier about it's a little overwhelming, because when you start to really dig deep and realize how much makes up a person, and every unique aspect of that, it can feel a little overwhelming, but I'm grateful for you guys, and thanks for doing this today.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, we'll explore those maps a little more gently next week. Natalie, and then Connie.
Hello.
Would you have a few words to check out in 15, 20 seconds?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm new to Zoom. I was just thinking about Edith Edgar. She is a 93-year-old Auschwitz survivor and had just came out with a book last year called The Gift. And she talks in there about a few things, 12 different ways on how to heal from traumas. A couple of the things that she said stuck with me was there is no forgiveness without rage. And she talks about some tools on how to move past the rage. She also says healing has to do something with changing something little by little. So some simple example would be no sugar in your coffee. Those little steps, which are obvious. But for me, the part that stuck on a personal level and also on a social level is, how do we forgive? And it's not that it can be any different, but how do we get rid of that rage that we have? And that's something I've worked through personally, and I see a lot in all these different situations.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Natalie. Appreciate you sharing that resource. And then Connie and Japa. Connie, would you be willing to share? Okay, thank you. Japa? You're on mute there, Japa.
Just the idea of feeling more consciously. I just feel like, we talked about how it's the body, man split, and we just have to, our feeling life is so rich and deep. And if we feel more consciously, in my own experience, that's how I work, is try to deepen my feeling perception and articulate that. I think that's one approach that gives us access to this complex map but starting from something integrated itself, which is our feeling life.
Yeah, thank you, Japa. Appreciate that. Raju, and then Julie.
Sure, Judd. The word that came up for me was integration, or integration of the perspectives, or yoking them together like a yoga. And then as people were talking, these other words came up. That was collective shadow work and collective forgiveness. A lot of these, in India and Pakistan, took 75 years for them to start feeling like they weren't brothers and sisters anymore. And they all became enemies. So if they could do that over 75 years, then maybe they could flip it and see how they are all brothers and sisters. Thank you. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us. Julie, and then Paula, and then Alicia.
Thanks for this. This is really interesting. I'm excited to learn more about it. The thing that I think struck me the most was I'm always struggling for balance in my life, and often feel like I work from a place of survival, of just trying to make it through today and take care of the kids and finish work and do the things I got to do. And so living more intentionally, and I really like those ideas of the core practices and trying to implement those in a regular way, and in a search for balance and a way to grow. So I appreciated that, and I look forward to learning more about it.
Great, thanks, Julie. Paula, Alicia, and then Dave.
Well, yeah, I'm super interested in shadow work these days, and I would love to have a group of people who, you know, we don't have to be doing exactly the same shadow work, just have a conversation about it, be able to share our both the work that we're doing and what comes of that, because I think it's personal and collective at the same time. And I'm fascinated by Bert Hellinger's family constellation work, and I'm studying it, and I'd love to learn to facilitate it, and I'm interested in anybody else, like in connecting with anybody else who's interested in that work.
Beautiful, thank you. And thanks for sharing your dreams on Facebook the last couple of days. Those have been rich and bold of you to do, so thank you. Alicia, and then David.
I'm just going to keep it quick. I think positive energy, hope, and gratitude is really what has surfaced for me from this session. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you. David, and then we'll give Wes the final word.
And just listening to people's checking out, what came up for me was this bias that I have that, you know, I need to get rid of the stuff that doesn't make me whole, you know, become a better or perfect person. And in fact, what popped in my head was, wow, then I lose my ability to really connect and empathize with other people. So in what ways can I maybe own more of my own shadow in a compassionate, graceful manner, because it can be a diamond for being able to connect and relate to other people, because it's something common to all of humanity, as one of you pointed out.
Yeah, thank you, David. Wes, you got the final word.
David inspired these final words, but as we walk towards a light or the light, often the shadow behind us gets longer and it reaches farther. But we don't get to recognize that shadow unless we turn around. But, you know, as the shadow will be there as long as we keep walking towards the light. And we will often be in stages of development and moving through them and not necessarily recognize them. Or when we do, it's important to recognize that grace is what allows others in the space to walk and work on their work as well. And that it's important for us to have that leeway with others. So just walk towards the light and we'll be okay.
Beautiful. Thank you, Wes. You always have a nice way of wrapping things up. I want to thank each of you, especially David, Alicia, and Wes, for being on and sharing, really everybody sharing your wisdom and thoughts. Again, this was my hope, right, is that we develop a community of integral practice where we can support each other in our inner work, and together we can create a Louisville and a world and a globe where we can live in peace and all thrive. Thanks for being with us. And next week, we will be looking at integral relationships. And I'm really excited about that one. This is it'll be a new thing for me to teach on. So it's got some really important and powerful maps. I look forward to the conversation. Hope you'll come back and join us next week. Thank you all for being you. Peace and have a blessed day. You're welcome to unmute yourself and wave and say goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good to
Bye,
be with
everyone.
you.
See you all next week.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, you all.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Ken.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.